Once again, then, this time more officially, Shana Tova Umutaka, good and a sweet year to you all. It's wonderful to see you. It's wonderful to be back at Emanu-El. My year and a half consulting with Emanu-El was an extraordinary experience for me. I got to meet the most wonderful people. I got to know the culture of this incredible institution, and I do consider myself an honorary member by now. Joel and I make it a point of coming here for Yom Kippur every year, and whenever we can. If we're in the city, we don't live in New York City, we live in Westchester County, but whenever possible, we do try to find our way here. So I greet you as at least an honorary member of Temple Emanu-El for you who are members. And I'm happy, therefore, to be here. Joel, I'm sure, will add his own words at the time. We thought that we would talk about, or actually we would converse about, that's why I've asked you to move up close so we could have something of a conversation, converse about justice and mercy. That is the theme, obviously, of Yom Kippur. I noticed as I was sitting in services today, I remember the days when people didn't wear a kippah at all in Emanu-El. Some of you go back to that time. By now, times have changed. And I looked around the room, and I was really taken by the number of white kippot. And that's what's sitting outside to pick up if you want, right? And I thought to myself, this is officially known as Yom Hadin. This is the day of judgment. Now, judgment can be merciful or just or both. We're going to talk about that. But in the liturgy, when it says Yom Hadin, it has the sense of, oh my God, judgment. And you know, that's the sort of the sense of the day. All those confessions, all the things that somebody did wrong, and maybe we did some of them, the sense that we really require God to find us not guilty, and yet the theme of the day is that it might be a guilty verdict. That will only change when you get to the last service. At the last service of Ne'ilah, the whole mood changes, because then you know that you're sort of home safe by then. But the mood for the day, traditionally at least for 2,000 years, more or less, has been a sense of justice in the kind of heavy sense. And yet, we wear white. The white kippot are a sign of this day. And that comes largely from the Middle Ages, in the mystical tradition, which thought that white was the symbol of mercy. And so here we are, even in our being. We know it's a day of justice, and what do? We dress up with a sense of mercy. Justice and mercy intertwine today, but they intertwine in society. They intertwine in our lives. I can remember being a kid. I did something wrong. And I said, oh, what's going to happen to me? And I can remember my two parents having a disagreement on that subject. One of them thought it was time for some justice. And the other one thought, nah, you know, he's a good kid. Mercy would be better. I'll let you decide which one was my father and which one was my mother. So we find ourselves always in that situation, don't we? How to treat situations, how to treat ourselves, how to treat other people we know. And what do we do in our society? How shall society operate? This is a big question that we're supposed to face today. So what we've done is, Joel and I have put together, indeed, a tag team, father-son routine. I'm going to begin. I'm going to take you through some interesting texts on justice and mercy, not all of which are Jewish. In fact, some of the most interesting ones are not. And at the end, we're going to look at a particular text that is in our tradition, and you'll see how our rabbis handled the subject. And then Joel will address the subject from a different perspective from his own. Would you please look at this? You should have a page looking like this. So we're going to start with some things from world literature, and I call it the light and the serious. You'll see why in just a moment. We start with something by Robert Fulghum. How many people have read All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten? Remember that book? It was sort of a bestseller book some years ago. So whether he learned this in kindergarten, I'm not sure. But here's what he says. If we could just figure out how to have more fun at it, maybe more of us would join the ranks of those who seek after justice and mercy. Now, how many people like that? Put your hand up. How many people don't like that? We'll try again. How many people agree with him? How many people disagree with him? How many people think that it's hard to actually think about justice and mercy in our dealings? How do you what?
How do you have more fun with it?
How do you have more fun with it? That's a very good question. This he learned in kindergarten. I will give him a pass. Not everything that said to me my kindergarten teacher was the deepest or easy to carry out in practice. Let's move on. Abraham Lincoln, I think, was a more serious, we shall say, a more serious source. What does Abraham Lincoln say? I have always found that mercy bears richer fruit than strict justice. How many people think that Lincoln was right? Can we put your hand up higher so we can see? It's called an elbow. You get to bend it. Yeah, good. How many people think that Lincoln is wrong? Wrong. Now, I suspect Lincoln said this. We can imagine, given the context. I don't know exactly when he said it. I couldn't trace that down. But I imagine he said it with regard to how to deal with the South at some point. That's my guess. Now look at Agatha Christie. Who knows more about justice, Agatha Christie or Abraham Lincoln? How many people have read Agatha Christie novels? Is there anyone who hasn't ever read an Agatha Christie novel? Or seen an Agatha Christie played on TV? Right, okay. Agatha Christie wrote hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books, really. There's an expert. They're all about justice and mercy. And she says, do you see it? Too much mercy often resulted in further crimes, which are fatal to innocent victims, who need not have been victims if justice had been put first and mercy second. Now, if you didn't like Lincoln, you should like Christie. Is that right? Yes, okay, good. Of all those people who liked Lincoln, is Christie wrong? Can they both be right? How could they both be right? Agatha Christie was thinking about the particular, but not the general. That's quite possible. Quite possible, okay? You can see, however, how people struggle with it. Because the truth is, just like on today, when you know it's about justice, you also know it's somehow about mercy. And they are sometimes in conflict. And it's very hard to decide what to do. This is a serious problem, never mind sometimes the unserious quotations, many of which I have here. We move now to C.S. Lewis. How many people have seen Chronicles of Narnia? It was on TV for quite a while. Yeah, it was a movie, wasn't it? All right. C.S. Lewis is an interesting man. He was not ever ordained, but he was a lay preacher and a lay theologian. And indeed, he was a serious theologian, even though he wrote books that sometimes looked not to be serious, like something called the Screw Tape Letters, which is a series of letters to the devil and back. But he was a serious theologian in England. And he says, mercy detached from justice grows unmerciful. Pardon me? It's a marriage of the two ones we had before. He's read Christie, though he hadn't, of course, not to mention Lincoln, but it's as if he had read them both and put them together. Nicely put. Yes?
I suggest you stop using the microphone because the echo makes it very hard to hear you.
Oh, can you hear me like this? Oh, that's better. Thank you. I'll speak up. How's that? Can you hear me? Yeah? If you're way at the back, maybe you can move a little forward because the echo is making it hard to pick me up altogether. Okay, I'll try to speak up and project. Very good. All right, so C.S. Lewis seems to put together the two of them. That's what theologians do, I suppose. And now we're up to this man, Sir Terence David John Pratchett, who is said to be a humorist and an author of fantasy novels. Has anyone read anything by this gentleman for a long name? I hadn't either. That's why I put Sir in front of his name. I figured by calling him Sir, that would indicate that he is to be listened to. Whereas otherwise, now the question is this an act of justice or mercy? Maybe if I hold it farther away. How's that? I think maybe he's turning it down? Okay. At any rate, I decided I would put Sir in front of his name, and that would give him some kind of a pedigree. At any rate, he has something interesting to say. It's tongue-in-cheek, maybe. The good are innocent and love justice. The bad are guilty, which is why they invent mercy. Does anyone want to say they think this is a wise statement? This is true? Cynical. Yeah, it is pretty cynical. Right, exactly. I'm sorry? Can mercy be justice as well? That's well put. That's a very good question. Anything else come to mind? Okay. Now we come to another British author. I remember being introduced to the history of Tom Jones, an 18th century piece of British literature. I did not get very far into it.
I don't have the paper.
Oh. There's an extra. Good. Does anyone else not have one? Okay. So, but Henry Fielding is an early British author. And like Charles Dickens, he's an expert at names. One reason to read these British authors is that all you do is read the name of the people in the book and you know exactly all about them. So here is Tom's teacher, who's known as Thwackum. Get it? Thwackum was for doing justice and leaving mercy to heaven. Anybody go to a school like that? British schools are known for Thwackums. Okay, next page. John Steinbeck. Now we're back in American territory. He says, what could be more frightening than a child with total power? A spear and sword are terrible, God knows. That is why the knight who carries them is first taught pity, justice, mercy, and only last, force. Now, who said we can combine justice and mercy? That's what he seems to be doing here. You need to be taught both of them. So sometimes they both go together. And here's my actual personal favorite from President Ford. Anybody remember President Ford? Yeah, I do. Anybody remember President Ford, but you won't admit you're that old? President Ford wasn't president a long time. But take a look what he says. I do believe with all my heart and mind and spirit that I, not as president, but as a humble servant of God, will receive justice without mercy if I fail to show mercy. Isn't that nice? Pardon me?
It must have been just before he pardoned Richard Nixon.
Just before he pardoned Richard Nixon, he said that? He also pardoned Robert E. Lee? Well, well, well. I did not know that. He also pardoned Robert E. Lee. Yeah? Along with Richard Nixon. Those are the two people he pardoned? Were there others? Well, that's a statement in itself, isn't it? Okay, well, that does add something to the quote, doesn't it? But finally, I'm going to end with Shakespeare. I mean, you can't do better than end with Shakespeare. And this is a very famous speech by Shakespeare. It is in The Merchant of Venice. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above the sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself, and earthly power doth then show likest gods when mercy seasons justice. And then he continues, in the course of justice, none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy. But lest you think that that's Shakespeare's only word on the subject, later on he wrote Timon of Athens, lesser known play than Merchant of Venice. And he says there, nothing emboldens sin so much as mercy. Shakespeare himself then changed his mind depending on the circumstance. And in the first play, that's the play about Shylock, where Shylock wants his pound of flesh. He has the hero say to Shylock, justice? What you really need is mercy here. Show us mercy. Whereas in the later play of Timon in Athens, different situation, he decides in that case, just the opposite. We need justice. You can see then in all of these quotations, some of them funny, some of them old, some of them new, some of them by Americans, some by British, and all sorts of different points of view. You can see that people struggle with it. Sometimes they struggle seriously, and sometimes they are a little more acerbic, right? It all depends. But you cannot get through life without having to decide how much justice and how much mercy, when to be just, when to be merciful. On what side of the scale do you come down? Do you come down strongest in favor of justice, or do you come down strongest in favor of mercy? That is what makes us who we are. And today we are asked to consider that question. So now, having looked at some world literature, I want to show you one piece of the liturgy, our own literature, and show you how the rabbis dealt with it. And that will lead into Joel's remarks, where he'll follow through on yet some other aspects. So first of all, what we're going to look at is a biblical quotation. It's a quotation from when Moses is on Mount Sinai, and Moses wants to see God, and he sees God's attributes. They are known as the 13 attributes. It's a little hard to count 13, however, so never mind the number, but they're called God's 13 attributes, and it's famous. We're going to look at this, what God shows Moses. This is what I'm like, says God. And you're going to look, as we look at it, you'll decide how much mercy is there and how much justice. Then we're going to look at how that biblical quotation enters our liturgy, and it's part of our liturgy of our prayers on holidays, including on Yom Kippur. And we'll see something quite fascinating. So we're going to start with the quote at the top of page 3, I think it is. See it there? Number B1 from Exodus. Moses carved 2 tablets of stone like the first. And early in the morning he went up to Mount Sinai as Adonai had commanded him, taking the 2 tablets of stone with him. Adonai came down in a cloud. He stood with him there and proclaimed the name Adonai. Adonai passed before him and proclaimed, and now come the 13 attributes. Try and decide are they merciful or just? Which one is God? Primarily merciful, primarily just? By the Bible's own mandate, own testimony. Adonai, Adonai, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the thousandth generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. So far, the picture's pretty clear, isn't it? Yet, he does not remit all punishment, but visits the sins of the parents upon the children, and children's children upon the third and fourth generations. Is this primarily a merciful or a just God? What do you think? A little bit of both, but what stands out? Again? There's a balance. You see a balance? Okay. Yeah, if he extends the punishment to the children's children, I mean, that's not what you call merciful, is it? I mean, I would hate to think, how many generations here? I'd hate to think it's children's children, so it's what, your grandparents' generation? Yeah, I mean, I don't even know what my grandparents did. Who knows? I'd hate to think that my grandchildren are going to, yeah.
Well, don't you think that part of the idea of balancing mercy and justice is to frighten us into being more just in our behavior because we might not get for our children that mercy? So creating more of a risk that our behavior will be visited on the next generation.
Nice. Just, you said that you put it so well, I'm not even trying to even paraphrase it. What did you say?
I simply said that perhaps the balancing of justice and mercy is meant to help discipline these two conflicting tendencies, one which is harsh and one which is gentle. And without the gentleness, we become too harsh. And without the harshness, we may become undisciplined.
Okay, so they're trying to get at a balance. One more comment?
Just wanted to point out that the sins of the parents, extend upon the children only goes to the third and fourth generations, whereas the abounding in kindness and faithfulness extends to the thousandth generation.
Nice. Okay, very nice comment. Well, the rabbis take a look at this, and they decide to put this in our liturgy. Now, the rabbis played fast and furious with the Bible. They took the Bible and they said, God didn't just give us revelation written down, but surely God also gave us interpretations. They insisted on the interpretive power of each generation, of their generation, and they therefore took biblical texts and they sometimes amended them for use in our prayers. Now you remember what we just read. Now we're going to see what the rabbis do with that text. Here are the 13 attributes according to what you read in our prayer book. Adonai, Adonai, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the thousandth generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, and remitting punishment. What do? What do the rabbis do with the original text? They omit the last half. They love the mercy part. They just leave out the rest of it. Now, the rabbis have in mind reading prayers, coming to synagogue. When it comes to our experience of God, unlike Moses' possibility, they want us to know that God is not just as much as God is merciful. They do their best then to make God into a merciful deity, even on this day, which is a day of justice. So they struggle with it by leaving out half of what the Bible says. And we get a picture of God who is all merciful, and that's what you will see when you take the Torah out of the ark and the 13 attributes of God are read. You only get the first half of what the Bible has to say. From all of this, what you see then is that world literature struggles with the human problem. How much justice, how much mercy? We need to have both. And we cannot get through life without deciding, not just on the grand scale, but on any given day. What do we do with our children? What do we do with someone who does something wrong? What do we do in work when somebody does something that's terrible? Or how terrible is it? And of course, anyone here a judge? I should have asked that at the beginning. How about lawyers? Surely there are lawyers in this crowd. All right. So good for you. All right. Then you know what it's like, of course, to struggle with this in the courtroom, to struggle with this when real lives are at stake. But there are more than just the real lives of people in the courtroom at stake. Our lives are at stake too. And with that, I'll hand it over to Joel.
Thank you. How are we doing with the sound? Apparently, I do need this because we're live streaming, and we're only live streaming through the microphone. So I'm told that I do need it. But as long as people here, as well as people at home can hear, that's great. I remember once I was presenting, and at the Q&A after an hour and a quarter, I opened up the floor, and some lady in the back raised her hand for Q&A, and I called on her, and she said, "Your microphone's not on." And that's the sort of thing I wish people had mentioned earlier rather than later. So if you cannot hear me, please mention it earlier rather than later. I want to segue with what might start off as a surprising segue, which is I once had the opportunity to undergo a full psychiatric workup. I don't know if you've ever done this. It's fascinating. And so I'm sitting in some guy's office, and we're basically just schmoozing, and he's got a whole list of questions he's asking me. And he's asking me the questions, and I'm answering the questions, and I'm looking around. And at one point, he asks me, "Do you ever see things that are not there?" And I thought about it. And I said to him, "Well, how would I know?" Wow, is that the wrong answer? Pro tip, the right answer is no. Though it also turns out that it was the wrong question. The question was supposed to be, do you ever see things that other people do not? Which is apparently an important question for diagnosing certain things. But ever since, I've been thinking about that. Do I ever see things that are not there? It comes up over and over again, and I think the answer might be yes. Like, I see injustice. For example, I look out at the world and I see injustice. Is that something that's there, or am I seeing things that are not there? And that's the connection. When I look out and see injustice, anyone ever have that happen? Do you wake up in the morning and turn on the TV or walk through the streets? Do you see injustice? Yeah. Are we seeing things? Don't like, if you're ever doing the test, like mention this. It's a terrible idea. But do we see things that are not there? And in this context, I think of the prophet Micah. Higid lecha adam, ma Adonai daresh mincha. You have been told what God demands of you. Asot mishpat, to do justice. There's more. We're going to do the whole quote. But Micah says, you have been told what God demands of you, to do justice. It's a common theme. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice. Justice shall you pursue. I'm sorry? We're going to get there. No, it's not, it's not up there, is it? The question was, what's the next phrase? We're going to get to it. There are 3 parts of it. But, spoilers. I mean, I guess it's not a spoiler if we haven't actually done it yet, but spoilers. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Hatzigu v'sha'ar mishpat. Establish justice in your city gates. The city gate was the city square. They didn't have city squares. The gate was the meeting area for everybody. Justice, justice, justice over and over again. The Bible demands that judges not show deference to the rich or to the poor. That is an incredible thing for the rich to have written, that both the rich and the poor have to be judged equally. You're not allowed to favor the rich, you're not allowed to favor the poor. We, by and large, taking a look at the world, I think do a pretty good job of that in this country. I think at the very least, that is one of the goals of America, that justice should be blind to individual circumstance, that the rich and the poor should be judged alike. It's not true all over the world. I was in Morocco, I guess a year and a half ago, and with my father, we were touring around, and we were going to a village with a Jewish cemetery in it, and we entered the village, and as in many places, there are sort of police checkpoints in the entrances to the villages and the towns, and we asked what they were for, and the answer was, well, it's not dangerous, if that's what you're asking. Okay. And this particular police checkpoint decided to give us a police escort through the town. So there it is, me and my father and a driver and a guide and two Moroccan cops on motorcycles paving the way for us. I didn't know why. We never did find out why. We got as far as the Jewish cemetery, but it turned out actually to be a replica of a Jewish cemetery, or a facsimile of a Jewish cemetery. And the sun was beating down, and we didn't stay very long. And as I'm walking out, someone comes up to me and says in French, "I'm the caretaker." I'm like, bonjour, okay, hi. And then he repeats it. He says, "I'm the caretaker." And I says, "That's nice." And he says, "I'm the caretaker." Well, you don't have to tell me 4 times. So I took out my wallet and I gave him what I think was the equivalent of $10. And there's a policeman standing there. And the policeman now says to me, "Don't you have anything for me?" Well, I don't generally walk in that part of society, but I know enough to know that when a policeman asks you if you have money for him, the answer is yes. And so I said, "Of course I do, my friend." I put my arm on his shoulder to demonstrate our new friendship. That may have been going too far. And I gave him similarly about $10 US. And I didn't really care. It was fine. And I got back in the car and I was telling our guide about this. And the guide was furious. The guide says, "What?" He says, "The police shouldn't be asking you for money." He says, "The police should be asking me for money." It was so ingrained in his culture that you give money to the police to get protection, to get the things that you take for granted in this country, that he was not even upset about it. He took it for granted. His problem was a breach of protocol. He had asked the wrong person, that's all. The bribe hadn't been handled properly. That was the guide's beef with what was going on. We, by and large, don't have that problem in America. Let me ask you this. How many of you think you could successfully bribe an NYPD police officer on the street? How many people think that would work? How many people here would be shocked to find out that it did work? I'm raising my hand. I would be shocked. How many people would be shocked to find out that an officer was actually taking... It really very, very rarely happens in this country. And I'm grateful for that. I like the fact that I can trust the police. I remember in Argentina asking someone about the police. I said, if your stuff was stolen, you wouldn't call the police? And the police probably took it. You might call them to get it back. And I like the fact that there's law and order. I actually feel very badly about the fact that speed limits in this country, I guess fancy myself an expert on it, are set too low. Because it's a law that I regularly break, and I don't like breaking the law. I like the fact that you follow the law. I work with high school kids, and a lot of the high school kids will tell me that there's no harm in a 16-year-old drinking, that it's perfectly safe. And I say that may or may not be true, but it's still illegal. And there's merit in following the law. There's merit in saying, this is the law, it applies to me as well. You don't get to make up your own laws. On the other hand, I was once on a fact-finding mission to the Ukraine. I call it the Ukraine because I read that somewhere. You might just call it Ukraine. I was on a fact-finding mission to the Ukraine, visiting a children's orphanage in the middle of winter. As my father says, nothing says fun like an orphanage in winter in Ukraine. And it was actually a very difficult trip. It was worth it. The plan was we would each bring one suitcase, and the other suitcase would be a duffel bag full of toys. The airline gave us 2 bags that we could bring. So I had my carry-on, I had my normal large American suitcase, because you never know what you're going to need when you go to the Ukraine, and I had a whole duffel bag full of toys. Now, mind you, my ancestors were massacred in the Ukraine, and the lucky ones managed to get out. So it was a very emotional experience going there, and I had a certain degree of trepidation as I sort of landed in Ukrainian soil in Odessa. And we're met with somebody there who brought us to a VIP room where we now fill out the landing forms. And he told us, he says, when it says, do you have any gifts, check no. And I understand why, but I envisioned myself having to explain to somebody why, in addition to shirts and jeans and shoes, I had brought a duffel bag full of toys with me for my week in Ukraine if they were not gifts. And he said, just check no, you don't have any gifts. And we did what we were told. And he took all of our passports and all the landing forms and went, shall we say, to have a discussion with an immigration official, and we were welcomed to the Ukraine. Now, I don't know for sure what happened there. Show of hands, how many people think it was entirely legal? How many people think there may have been a bribe involved in getting that into the... Yeah. Was that wrong? I'm pretty clear that I broke, I had, my guy do it. I didn't do it myself. I had someone else break the law for me. But I smuggled toys into the Ukraine, I guess. Now, I'm on the side of the angels. I was bringing them to orphans in an orphanage. But it does strike me that it was illegal. How many people think I did the right thing, just out of curiosity? How many think there's a problem with that? With breaking the law? What if we flipped it around? What about lying to come into the United States? How many people think that might be a problem? Yeah, well, see, the United States is our country as opposed to, their country and so on. Question, comment, or raising the hand? Yeah. Okay, so it's not about our country versus their country. It's about who wrote the law. Does it represent the will of the people? Was it a just law in the first place? And it's a fascinating comment, and we're not really going to have time to delve into the issues that raises, because we actually use justice in 2 different ways. One is things that are fair, and one is the actual law. Now, they're supposed to be the same. You're supposed to have the laws reflect what is actually fair. And believe it or not, the motivation behind that runs very, very deep in the human psyche. If you have a couple of children, friends, siblings, doesn't matter, and they are punished for something they did, they won't like it, but they won't complain nearly as much as if they are punished for something they didn't do. If you punish them for something they didn't do, they will complain incredibly fiercely. Furthermore, if both of them did that, and only one of them gets punished, what does that person say? What does that child say? It's not fair. And that is it's not a philosophical observation about the world. It's an emotional, gut-wrenching reaction. It's not fair. Children demand fairness. We all demand fairness. In fact, we never really outgrow it. In that sense of justice, we still demand fairness, even though fairness is a terrible idea. If the world were fair, when your neighbor's house burned down, so would yours. That's not really what anybody wants. They want the good part of the fairness. They don't want the bad part of the fairness, and it still strikes us incredibly powerfully in the gut. It turns out that evolutionarily, this goes back way before we were people. The great apes demand fairness. Dogs demand fairness. If you have 2 dogs and you give them food they like, they will eat it. If you give them food they don't like, they're dogs, they will eat it. But if you give two dogs, one of them the good food and one of them the bad food, the dog that gets the bad food will not eat it. Why is that? Because it's not fair. I can relate to that when I drive. Almost all of my metaphors involve driving because I live in Westchester. I don't mind so much being in traffic. But you know what I really, really, really hate, and I think you know what's coming, is when I'm in the exit lane and I've put in my time and I've waited 23 minutes to get to the exit and someone comes along and jumps in front of me and gets there before I did. That's not fair. I don't mind it so much when I'm the guy who does that, if we're going to be perfectly honest. But when other people do it, it's not fair. And our laws are supposed to be an extension of that idea. The laws are supposed to be an encoding, an enforcement of fairness that we all demand, going way back to before we were even human. You have been told what God demands of you, to do justice and to love mercy is the next part of that line. Micah says you have been told what God demands of you, to do justice and to love mercy. I would like to think it was merciful of me to bring toys to the children in the orphanage in Ukraine. And if that's how it had to get done, then that's how it had to get done. I was okay abandoning sort of that part of justice because I was doing mercy. We see things putting these two in conflict all the time. One of the clearest examples I can remember goes back to a little bit before the pandemic. How many people can remember before the pandemic? We had an immigration problem on our border with Mexico. And we ended up with children in cages in our country. You don't need me to tell you that children shouldn't be in cages. If it was any of our children, anybody we knew, if it was the children of anybody we knew, if it was our children or our grandchildren, or if it was someone we had taught or someone that our children was friends with, we would have been marching on Washington to let them out. We know children shouldn't be in cages. Was it just? Was it part of justice? It turns out it was legal. It was a response to a real problem. It put into juxtaposition these two sometimes contradictory ideas of justice and mercy. What we were all saying at that point is, where's the mercy? We are supposed to love mercy. Now, before I go on with this example, I want to jump to the third thing that Micah says, which is, to walk humbly with your God. You're not only supposed to do justice and love mercy, but to walk humbly with your God. And that's because nobody has a monopoly on truth. Nobody has all of the truth. Nobody knows all of the right answers, and we should therefore walk humbly when we look at the world and look at what is going on, recognizing that maybe we have all of the information and maybe we don't. Maybe we have the right answer, maybe we don't. That's why Temple Emanu-El is a nonpartisan institution, because nobody has a monopoly on truth. I remember I was running a religious school once, and I accidentally hired somebody who was supposed to have come very highly recommended. But it turns out it was somebody else who came highly recommended. And I didn't really interview the teacher, which turned out to be a problem when I found out that she wanted to teach her 10-year-olds that the Arabs in Israel should be murdered and driven into the street, a la Meir Kahane. Would it be okay, she wanted to know, if she showed a Meir Kahane video to the 10-year-olds? And I had to say something diplomatic, like, well, I think perhaps another video might work better. And at one point, she was sitting in my office, and she was spouting the conspiracy theory that President Obama was a Muslim. She kept saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. And I felt like saying, you know, what idiot hired you? But of course, that was me. My job was to support her. My job was to make her feel like a valued member of the staff. Rabbi Ami Hirsch on the West Side, I remember him saying, you support your employees until you don't. If I'm not going to fire her, I have to support her. And here she is sitting in my office talking about the stupidest thing you have ever heard in your life. And I'm sitting, I can't say, you know, what's wrong with you? I can't yell. So I'm looking and I'm thinking about it. And it was a very painful 45 minutes for me. And after that 45 minutes, I walked into the rabbi's office, into Rabbi Paul Gollum's office, and Rabbi Paul Gollum says to me, you know, he says, it makes you wonder what we're sure of that's wrong. Hatsnea lechet im Elohecha, walk humbly with your God, because nobody has a monopoly on truth. Ezehu chacham alomed mikol adam, who are wise? Those who learn from everybody. And I mention all of this because in this country, when we have issues of importance, they tend to be expressed through politics. And once it gets expressed through politics, it tends to look like it's political. And some things are political, but some things are a matter of the people. When the children were in cages, it ended up being political, and people ended up debating along political lines. And this happens all the time. I choose this just as one prominent example, when all of us were crying out for mercy. There are more difficult examples. I was just having dinner in the city, and I'm sure this has happened to you. I was eating outside at a actually surprisingly good Italian restaurant. And a homeless man came up to us while we were eating. Here I was enjoying a nice meal. I'd driven in from Westchester, probably $50 to park in a lot, probably another $120 for the meal. This guy didn't have any food. Maybe. We don't know for sure who he was. And I'm sure you've been in this situation, or if not this exact one, hundreds more like it. And I can tell you what I remember thinking, and it wasn't my proudest moment, but my biggest thought was, I hope he doesn't come over here, is what I remember thinking. But he did. He's now standing right next to our table. And so I gave him some money, and the owner of the restaurant was not at all happy about that. The owner of the restaurant said, you know, he's just acting. Well, a little bit of mercy, I thought. I had the same thing happen when I was in India. It was Shabbat morning, and I'm walking around trying for the love of God to get a good latte and croissant, and I had to go to the ATM. I took out a couple $100, which is enough to live for almost a year for many people in India. And as I'm walking in search of the restaurant, I would say a 6-year-old girl comes up to me, not wearing any shoes, looking as pitiful as you could possibly imagine. She's 6 years old, and it's the Sabbath. And I just took out a few $100. I don't remember how many $100, and that's sort of the point. And she would have been very happy to get 10 cents. Because, 10 people give her 10 cents. That's enough for the whole day. And, of course, I didn't have 10 cents. And I gave her $1. And one of the people I know in India was furious with me. He said, first of all, she's a professional. This was in one of the hill stations. If you know India, this was in Missouri. She says, there are no children beggars in Missouri. This child came from the town an hour away by car. How do you think she got here? Someone brought her here. They brought her here. This is their business. And he said to me, you are ruining India. He was furious. He said, and his point was, she's a professional. And my point was, I don't care. I don't care if she's a professional. I don't care if someone has taken her and said, this is what you're going to do for the day. She's a 6-year-old girl walking around with no shoes. Now, granted, she may not mind as much as I would, but she's still 6 years old walking around when I'm going to buy a croissant and coffee. V'ahavat chesed, and love mercy. Now, I did listen to my friend there, Hatsnei lechet im Elohecha. We don't know everything. We should learn from other people. But in this particular case, the bigger picture I sort of felt like was not my concern. Whether it's just or unjust didn't really seem to be the point. The point was, here was a girl who needed help, and I could help her, and I'm not going to miss the $1 that I gave her. I could have given her $20 and I wouldn't have missed it, though I probably would have had a long line of children following me around for the rest of the day. So it's probably a good thing that I didn't do that. This issue, though, comes up, it seems to me, most prominently when it comes to immigration. We have built ourselves a pretty good life in this country. Look at where we are. And there are people who are trying to get into this country. There are not a lot of people sort of sneaking into Saudi Arabia by night so they can get a better life for their children in Saudi Arabia. There are not a lot of people sneaking into Venezuela. There are not a lot of people sneaking into even Kenya, places like that. They're sneaking into America because by and large we have a good life here. But some of them are skipping the line. Some of them are doing exactly what I said I hate. Some of them are jumping to the front, bypassing the legal procedures, skipping in front of people who have waited 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And unfortunately, it ends up in the political realm. What do we do with these people? What are we willing to sacrifice so that other people can feed their children? We can't sacrifice everything. I don't think anybody thinks that we should also give up any means we have of feeding ourselves. Not surprisingly, the prophet said it best. You have been told what God demands of you: justice and mercy, and to walk humbly. And I'll tell you something else. My grandfather snuck into this country, my mother's father. I'm not entirely clear on all of the details. It involved at least some mendacity and some sneakiness. May have involved some other things as well. The details are not clear to me. Whether he was technically illegal or not, I'm not sure. He may have gotten someone by trickery to sign a legal form. But he made it out into this great country, and that's why I'm standing here. I can still hear his voice. What he said to me is, in this life, I guess I do hear things that are not there as well, because I can still hear his voice. He said to me, in this life, you need a little mazel. You need a little luck. He was all for justice, but what he had that brought him into this country, which is why I can stand here today, was a little bit of luck and a little bit of compassion. Everybody has a preference, an innate personal preference for justice or for mercy. Everybody just automatically resonates more, depending upon who you are, with justice or with mercy. My challenge for you for the coming year, as we go through the final hours of Yom Kippur, is to ask yourself, what kind of person am I? Do I naturally resonate with justice, or do I naturally resonate with mercy? If I naturally resonate with mercy, maybe I should try and introduce some more justice into how I interact with the world. If I naturally resonate with justice, maybe I should introduce a little more mercy into how I naturally interact with the world. Because I imagine I am not the only one who can still hear his recent ancestor's voice. I bet if we are quiet, you will be able to, it's okay, you will be able to hear your ancestors' voices from 1 generation ago, from 3 generations ago, maybe from 4 generations ago, the voices from the old country, from the shtetl. And they're looking at us and they see what we have built. They see this incredible temple Emanu-El. They see what we have done with our lives. They see the means we have achieved. They see that we are able to influence the world in which we live. And those ancestors are screaming at us to use our influence and power for good, to make a positive difference in the world. You have been told what God demands of you. to do justice, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Shana Tova.